Why does God want to take my sister?
It's gonna be okay, buddy. We're here for her.
She grew up in his house, not as a guest, not as a favor, but as family. She called him Daddy without hesitation, ran into his arms after school, fell asleep on his chest during late nights when work followed him home. And he never questioned it, because in his mind, he had chosen her, adopted her, loved her intentionally. So, the truth never crossed his thoughts. Yet the truth was brutal in its simplicity. She wasn't just the child he raised. She wasn't just the daughter he protected. She was his, and he didn't know. Have you ever trusted someone so deeply that you never thought to question the foundation of that trust? Have you ever lived a life where everything felt settled, where love felt certain, only to realize later that the most important truth was standing right in front of you the whole time? Because that's what this story is really about. Not secrets hidden in shadows, not complicated schemes, but the quiet danger of assumptions, the kind that grows when love feels complete, when questions stop being asked, when everyone believes they already know the story. He believed he understood what family meant. She believed she knew where she came from, and neither of them realized how fragile those beliefs were, until one moment forced the truth into the open. Because this didn't begin in a hospital, and it didn't begin with a test result. It began years earlier, on a construction site in Chicago. A little girl sat near the edge of the project every day, not crying, not asking for money, just waiting. When the architect finally asked why she kept coming back, her answer stopped him in place. She said her mother told her she would find her father there. He looked around at cranes, workers, concrete and steel. He told her the truth as he understood it. Her father didn't work there, but the girl didn't leave. Days passed, then weeks. She kept returning to the same spot, calm, patient, certain. And without realizing it, the man who believed he was simply helping a child in need was stepping into a role that would change every part of his life. Years later, that same little girl would grow up in his home. She would become a woman, a mother of two, someone who believed her life story was already complete. And then a child's life would depend on a kidney transplant. Tests would be ordered. Blood would be drawn. Doctors would pause longer than expected. Because one result refused to make sense, the man who stepped forward to save his granddaughter wasn't just a match. He was connected in a way no one was prepared for. A truth surfaced that didn't just explain the past, it redefined it. And when that truth finally came to light, it answered a question that had been waiting for years. Why that little girl never stopped coming back to the construction site. Bestie, before we go any further, please like this video, drop a comment, and subscribe to Mr. Austin Love and Story Tales. It truly helps YouTube share stories like this with people who need them. Julian Cross woke before the city did. From the upper floor of his glass-front condo overlooking the Chicago River, the skyline stretched in clean lines and steel certainty. Towers stood where he expected them to stand. Streets followed their grid. Nothing surprised him here. This was the world he understood. Julian moved through his mornings with discipline. Coffee black, suit pressed, tablet already open to blueprints before the sun fully reached the water. His name carried weight in Chicago's architectural circles, luxury residential towers, museums, corporate headquarters. His designs shaped the city's future, and he was proud of that. On construction sites, his voice was calm and firm. Workers listened. Project managers deferred. Clients trusted him because Julian didn't build emotionally, he built precisely. Deadlines don't move, he reminded teams often. Structures don't forgive errors. People, however, did, and that was why he avoided relying on them. He spent most days moving between offices, design reviews, and active projects. His phone buzzed constantly. Investors, city planners, developers, but rarely with anything personal. That part of life stayed quiet by choice. Julian's evenings belonged to another version of himself. Cocktail receptions in River North, award dinners downtown, conversations filled with polished laughter and safe topics, funding, market trends, future projects, men in tailored suits, women in understated elegance, everything measured, everything controlled. "You're redefining modern space," someone said to him once, holding a crystal glass. Julian smiled politely. "I just solve problems." Applause never moved him the way it moved others. Awards sat unopened in boxes at home. Recognition mattered only as proof that his system worked. When colleagues spoke about spouses or children, Julian listened without envy. He nodded. He asked questions, but he never contributed much. Family was unpredictable. Careers were not. Late at night, alone in his condo, silence felt earned. No toys on the floor, no noise, no emotional negotiations. Just clean surfaces and clear plans for tomorrow. That was success as far as Julian was concerned. There had been one exception. Years earlier, long before awards and skyline projects, Julian had loved a woman who didn't fit neatly into his life. She laughed loudly. She asked uncomfortable questions. She challenged him when he tried to reduce life to logic. She came from a world filled with community, shared meals, and emotional honesty. She was black. She was brilliant. And she saw through him. "You design buildings like you're afraid of people," she once said, sitting across from him at a small Chicago cafe. Julian dismissed it at the time. "I design for function." "But people live in your function," she replied. They cared for each other deeply, but their worlds never fully aligned. Julian pulled inward when things grew emotional. She wanted connection, presence, shared life. When the relationship ended, it wasn't explosive. It was quiet, final. Julian told himself it was necessary. He never knew she was pregnant. By the time Julian reached the peak of his career, his belief was firm. Family complicated things. Love distracted. Children shifted priorities. Emotion introduced risk. He had seen it happen to peers, missed opportunities, compromised decisions, careers reshaped by responsibilities they hadn't planned for. Julian planned everything. So when a little girl would later appear at one of his construction sites, silent, patient, uncertain, he had no idea she would challenge every rule he lived by. At this point in his life, Julian Cross believed his foundations were solid. He was wrong. The construction site came alive before most of the city. By 6:30 each morning, trucks rolled in, steel clanged against steel, and voices carried across the open lot near the river. Yellow safety tape framed the perimeter, warning signs posted at every entrance. It was an active project, one of Julian Cross's most ambitious designs yet. And every morning, before the first foreman checked his clipboard, Gracie was already there. She sat on the low concrete barrier just beyond the site's edge, feet dangling, hands folded neatly in her lap. Her clothes were clean, but worn. Her backpack rested beside her, zipped and careful, like she expected to leave at any moment. She didn't wander. She didn't play. She didn't ask anyone for anything. She waited. Workers noticed her the first day, of course. A child standing alone was unusual, but not alarming enough to stop the pace of the job. Someone assumed her parent was nearby. Someone else thought she might belong to a nearby office. By the second day, she was still there. By the fourth, she had become part of the background, another fixed detail in a place built on movement. Gracie arrived early and left late. She watched everything with quiet focus. The cranes swinging overhead, the men in reflective vests shouting measurements, the architect's office trailer with its tinted windows and locked door. She never crossed the boundary. She never stepped where she wasn't allowed. It was as if she understood rules instinctively. At lunchtime, she ate slowly from a brown paper bag. In the afternoons, she shaded her eyes with her hand and stared toward the entrance of the site, scanning faces as they came and went, always looking for someone. Julian Cross didn't see her at first. For several days, he moved in and out of the site, without noticing the small figure near the barrier. His focus stayed on structural reports, design modifications, and conversations with engineers. But on the morning he finally noticed her, it was because she hadn't moved. He stepped out of his car, paused, and looked again. She was sitting in the same spot. Same posture, same calm stillness. A child didn't wait like that, unless she was waiting for someone. Julian hesitated, then turned toward the site office. He told himself it wasn't his responsibility. Children showed up in cities for many reasons. Still, as he walked past her, he felt something pull at his attention. She looked up, Their eyes met for a brief moment. Gracie didn't smile. She didn't wave. She simply watched him, as if confirming something to herself. Julian looked away first. Inside the site office, meetings went on as planned. Measurements were discussed, adjustments approved, yet Julian's focus slipped in ways it never did. When he stepped back outside later that afternoon, she was still there. Same place, same posture, waiting. Julian didn't plan to speak to her. He told himself that, as he stepped out of the site office that afternoon, tablet tucked under his arm, phone pressed to his ear, he had a call scheduled, numbers to confirm, deadlines that didn't wait. But Gracie was still there. She hadn't shifted from her place near the barrier. Her backpack sat upright now, like she'd adjusted it recently. She was watching the entrance again, eyes scanning every man who walked through. Julian ended his call early. He approached slowly, keeping his distance so he wouldn't startle her. "Hey," he said, his voice measured, professional, like he was speaking to a junior associate instead of a child. "Who are you waiting for?" Gracie looked up at him calmly. "You," she said. Julian paused. He glanced behind him, then back at her. "Me." She nodded once, as if the answer were obvious. "My mommy said I'd find my father here." The words landed softly, but they struck hard. Julian exhaled through his nose. He crouched slightly so he wasn't towering over her. "I think there's been a mistake," he said gently. "A lot of people work here." Gracie didn't argue. She didn't cry. She didn't ask him to believe her. She simply said, "She told me to wait." "For who?" "For my father." Julian searched her face for confusion, for fear, for something that would explain this in a way that made sense. Instead, he found certainty. "How long have you been coming here?" he asked. "Since last week." "And your mother?" Gracie hesitated, not long enough to look unsure, but long enough to feel intentional. "She's busy," she said. Julian straightened. He looked around the site, at the workers passing by, at the city beyond the fencing. Nothing about this situation fit into his orderly understanding of how life worked. "I don't think I'm the person you're looking for," he said carefully. Gracie accepted that answer the same way she accepted everything else. "Okay," she replied. But she didn't stand up. She didn't leave. She sat back against the concrete barrier and resumed watching the entrance. Julian walked away with an uneasy weight in his chest. He told himself he'd done his part. He told himself the city would correct whatever mistake had led her here. The next morning, she was back. Same spot. Same calm. Waiting. By the end of the second week, Gracie had become invisible to everyone except one person. The workers passed her every morning without slowing their steps. Some nodded. Some looked away. A few assumed someone else had already handled the situation. In a place where schedules ruled everything, a quiet child sitting outside the fence didn't register as urgent. "She'll leave eventually," one worker muttered during a lunch break. Another shrugged. "City kids wander all the time." No one asked her name. No one asked where she went at night. No one asked why she returned every morning at the same hour. Gracie didn't interrupt them. She didn't step into their space. She stayed exactly where she was allowed to be, as if she understood how easily adults stopped seeing what didn't demand attention. Julian, however, began noticing patterns. She arrived before the site officially opened. She left after the sun dipped behind nearby buildings. She never wandered farther than a few feet from the entrance. When rain fell, she shifted closer to the temporary awning. When the wind cut sharply through the lot, she hugged her jacket tighter and stayed. Julian watched from a distance at first. From his car, from the office window, from across the site, while speaking with engineers. She was always there. One afternoon, a foreman complained about a missing item from the site office, a gold chair used for client meetings. Voices rose briefly. Accusations circled lazily. "No one took it," a worker insisted. Gracie stood up for the first time in days. She walked closer to the fence and pointed calmly. "He moved it," she said, her small finger steady. "Yesterday, after lunch." The men turned toward her, startled. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't add details until asked. He put it in the truck with the blue stripe. He said it didn't belong there. Silence followed. Julian stepped forward without thinking. "Is that true?" he asked. The worker hesitated, then nodded. The chair was returned within minutes. Julian stared at Gracie, not impressed, not amused, but unsettled. She hadn't been watching aimlessly. She had been paying attention. That was when Julian realized something he couldn't ignore anymore. This child wasn't lost. She wasn't confused. And she wasn't waiting without purpose. She was certain. And certainty, Julian knew, didn't appear without a reason. After the chair incident, Julian could no longer pretend Gracie was simply part of the background. He didn't address it immediately. That wasn't his way. He observed first, letting facts settle before acting. But something had shifted. The sight felt different now, less predictable. Gracie returned the next day as usual. Julian watched her from his car before getting out. She sat quietly, hands folded, eyes forward. She didn't look tired. She didn't look afraid. She looked resolved, like someone keeping a promise she fully believed in. He walked past her again, slower this time. "Did you eat today?" he asked, stopping just short of the barrier. She nodded. "Yes, sir. Where do you go when you leave here?" "Home." "With who?" "My mom." The answer was immediate, rehearsed and closed. Julian didn't press further. He felt the tension rise instead, questions stacking up with no place to land. He had no proof anything was wrong, no report, no call, no visible danger, only instinct. At the site office, he mentioned her casually to a supervisor. "She's been waiting out there a while," Julian said. "Anyone talk to her parents?" The supervisor frowned. "Thought she was yours." Julian looked up. "Why would you think that?" The man shrugged. "She watches you. Only you." Julian didn't respond. That evening, after the site shut down, Julian lingered longer than usual. The sun dipped lower. Workers cleared out. Gracie stayed seated, her attention fixed on the entrance as if she were waiting for permission to leave. Julian approached once more. "You know you don't have to wait here," he said. She looked up at him. "I know." "Then why do you—" Gracie thought for a moment. "Not long. Just enough. Because my mommy said this is where it would happen." "What would happen?" She studied his face, searching, not for reassurance, but recognition. "She said I would know when I saw him." Julian felt a tightness settle in his chest. "And have you?" he asked quietly. Gracie didn't answer. She just looked at him, steady and unafraid. Julian stood there longer than he meant to. For the first time in years, he felt something unfamiliar pressing against his certainty. Not fear, not confusion, possibility. And that unsettled him more than any unanswered question ever had. The site office was supposed to be untouched. It sat slightly elevated from the rest of the construction zone, a temporary structure Julian used for meetings with developers and city representatives. Inside, everything had its place. Plans neatly rolled, documents stacked precisely, furniture positioned with intention. That morning, something was wrong. Julian noticed it the moment he stepped inside. The gold chair, the only one in the office not meant for daily use, was gone. It wasn't just decorative. The chair was reserved for clients, placed deliberately across from Julian's desk. It anchored the room, both visually and symbolically. Its absence threw off the balance immediately. Julian paused, scanning the room once more to be certain. Empty space. No chair. "Where's the chair?" he asked, his tone even but firm. The site manager looked confused. "Which chair?" "The gold one," Julian replied. "It was here yesterday." The manager frowned and stepped inside. He looked around, then shook his head. "I didn't see anyone move it." Julian didn't respond. He walked back outside, eyes sweeping the site instinctively. Equipment was where it should be, materials accounted for. Nothing else appeared disturbed. Yet the chair hadn't walked away on its own. Word spread quickly. A few workers gathered near the office. Someone suggested it had been moved for cleaning. Someone else claimed it might have been transferred to another trailer. Julian listened without interrupting. Each answer came too quickly, too casually. He looked past the group, toward the barrier near the entrance. Gracie was standing now, not sitting, not waiting, watching. Julian didn't raise his voice. He didn't accuse anyone outright. He stood just outside the site office, hands relaxed at his sides, listening as explanations overlapped. No one touched it. One worker said quickly, "Must have been moved earlier," another added. A third shrugged. Maybe it got sent to storage. Julian's eyes stayed on their faces. Years of meetings and negotiations had trained him to recognize when answers were rehearsed. These were too smooth, too aligned. Before he could respond, a small voice cut through the noise. He took it. Everyone turned. Gracie had stepped closer to the fence, her fingers wrapped around the metal rail. She wasn't pointing wildly or speaking loudly. Her voice carried because it didn't waver. Julian looked at her. "Who did?" She lifted her hand and pointed toward one of the workers standing near the supply truck. "Him." The man stiffened. "That's not true." Gracie didn't react to the denial. She simply continued. "He moved it yesterday," she said, "after lunch. He said it didn't belong in the office. He put it in the truck with the blue stripe and drove toward the south exit." Silence settled over the group. Julian turned to the worker. "Is that accurate?" The man opened his mouth, then closed it. His eyes shifted briefly toward the truck Gracie had mentioned. Another worker cleared his throat. "I did see him loading furniture yesterday." The accused man exhaled sharply. "I was going to bring it back." Julian nodded once. "Do that. Now." Within minutes, the gold chair was returned to its place inside the site office. No lectures followed. No raised voices. The workers dispersed quietly, conversations subdued. Julian remained where he was, looking at Gracie through the open door of the office. She had already stepped back to her usual spot near the barrier, as if nothing unusual had happened. But for Julian, everything had shifted. Julian watched Gracie from across the site after the chair was returned. She didn't look satisfied. She didn't look proud. She simply sat back down. That unsettled him more than the missing chair ever had. Most children would have spoken loudly. Some would have smiled, waiting for praise. Gracie did neither. She acted as if telling the truth was simply part of her responsibility. Julian approached her again, slower this time. "You noticed a lot," he said. Gracie nodded. "I pay attention." "To what?" "To people," she replied. "They forget when they think no one's watching." Julian paused. The answer was too measured for her age. Not rehearsed. Observed. "You weren't afraid to speak up," he said. She looked at him calmly. "Why would I be?" He didn't have an answer. There was no fear in her posture, no nervous movement, just quiet certainty. She hadn't exposed the lie to impress him or embarrass anyone. She had done it because it was right. Julian straightened, something shifting in his chest. This wasn't a child drifting through her days. This was a child aware of her surroundings, grounded and unshaken. And for the first time since he'd noticed her at the site, Julian understood something clearly. Gracie wasn't just waiting. She knew exactly why she was there. Julian stayed inside the site office longer than usual that afternoon. The gold chair had been returned to its place, positioned exactly where it belonged across from his desk. Under normal circumstances, that would have been enough. Order restored. Problem solved. But his attention refused to settle. He sat back in his chair and stared at the clean lines of the blueprints spread across the desk. Every measurement was precise, every angle accounted for. The structure rising outside followed rules he understood completely. People, however, did not. Julian found himself thinking about the way Gracie had spoken earlier, not loudly, not emotionally, but with calm certainty. She hadn't looked to him for approval after telling the truth. She hadn't waited to see how the workers would react. She had already moved on. That detail unsettled him. Most adults measured their words carefully around authority, children even more so. But Gracie hadn't adjusted herself at all. She had spoken because she believed it was necessary, and that belief hadn't shaken, even when grown men denied what she said. Julian closed the folder in front of him. He stood and stepped outside again. The site was quieter now. The afternoon rush had slowed. and workers moved with less urgency. Gracie was still near the barrier, seated exactly where she always was. Her backpack rested beside her, untouched. She wasn't watching the workers anymore. She was watching the entrance. Julian stopped a few steps away, unsure why he had come back out. He told himself he was checking on the site. He told himself this was part of his responsibility. Neither explanation felt honest. "You handled that situation well earlier," he said. Gracie looked up at him. Her expression didn't change. "It wasn't hard. That doesn't mean it was easy," Julian replied. She thought for a moment. "People make things harder when they don't want to say the truth." Julian nodded slowly. That answer landed deeper than he expected. He glanced around the site, then back at her. "You sit here all day," he said. "Don't you get tired?" "Sometimes," she admitted. "But you still come back." "Yes." "Why?" Gracie adjusted her position slightly, pulling her knees closer. She didn't answer right away, not because she was unsure, but because she seemed to be choosing her words carefully. "Because I trust what my mom told me," she said. Julian felt a faint tightening in his chest. "And what did she tell you?" "That I'd know when I found him." Julian didn't respond. He didn't ask who him was. He didn't correct her. For the first time since this situation began, he didn't feel the need to explain anything away. He looked at the small girl sitting across from him, her posture relaxed, her voice steady, her eyes alert but unafraid, and something shifted inside him. This wasn't recklessness. This was conviction. Julian had spent his life surrounding himself with certainty in measurable forms, contracts, designs, approvals. Yet Gracie carried a different kind of certainty, one that didn't require evidence to stand upright. And for reasons he couldn't yet explain, he respected it. A memory surfaced without warning. Years ago, before his career hardened him, someone had once told him he thought too much and felt too little. He had dismissed it then, just as he had dismissed most things that didn't fit neatly into his plans. Standing here now, he wondered if that distance had cost him more than he realized. "You shouldn't be sitting out here alone every day," he said quietly. Gracie didn't argue. "I know." "Then why do you—" She met his gaze directly this time. "Because if I leave, I might miss him." The words stayed with him as he walked away. Back inside the office, Julian stood near the window, watching the site from a distance. He told himself he was observing operations, but his eyes kept drifting toward the entrance, toward Gracie. He felt something unfamiliar pressing against his chest. Not panic, not fear, but awareness. A growing sense that the boundaries he'd built around his life weren't as secure as he believed. This child had stepped into his world quietly. She hadn't demanded space. She hadn't forced answers. And yet, she had unsettled him more than any professional challenge ever had. Julian realized with uncomfortable clarity that this wasn't a problem he could solve with logic alone. This was something else entirely. And for the first time in years, Julian Cross didn't immediately retreat from the feeling. Julian didn't make the decision all at once. It arrived in pieces, quiet moments that settled into him before he had time to push them away. The first change was small. He began asking about Gracie before asking about site progress. It surprised his team. It surprised him too. But once he noticed the shift, he didn't correct it. "She's here already?" he asked one morning, scanning the entrance. "Yes," a supervisor replied. "Same spot." Julian nodded, as if that were expected. Gracie continued to arrive early and leave late. Nothing about her routine changed. What changed was Julian's attention. He began carrying an extra bottle of water in his car. One morning he left a sandwich on the concrete barrier without comment. She accepted it with a quiet thank you and returned to watching the site. No demands, no attachment, just presence. One afternoon, rain swept through Chicago without warning. Workers rushed to cover equipment, voices raised over the sudden weather. Julian noticed Gracie standing beneath the narrow shelter near the fence, jacket pulled tight, shoes damp. Without thinking, he walked over. "You shouldn't be standing out here in this," he said. She looked up. "It'll stop soon." Julian hesitated. "You can wait inside the office." Gracie studied him, searching his face the way she always did, carefully, deliberately. "Is that okay?" she asked. Julian surprised himself with how easily the answer came. Yes. Inside the site office, Gracie sat on the edge of a chair, hands folded, eyes taking everything in. She didn't touch anything without permission. She didn't wander. She simply waited, now sheltered. Julian returned to his desk, but the room felt different with her there. Not disruptive, just altered. That evening, when the rain cleared and the site closed, Julian walked her to the sidewalk. "Who picks you up?" he asked. "My mom," Gracie replied. "And if she doesn't?" "She will." The certainty in her voice didn't reassure him the way it once might have. Instead, it raised questions he could no longer ignore. That night, Julian made calls he had avoided for weeks. He spoke with a social worker. He spoke with a legal advisor. He asked questions without committing to answers. What happens if a child is spending this much time alone near a work site? He asked. What responsibilities does an adult have if they're aware? He asked next. Each answer pushed him closer to a line he hadn't planned to cross. The following morning, Gracie was there again. Julian crouched beside her. "I need to talk to your mother," he said. She nodded. "Okay. Can you tell her that?" "Yes." That afternoon, Julian finally met her mother. The conversation was brief, controlled, heavy with unspoken truths. She explained circumstances without excuses. Julian listened without judgment. When it ended, he didn't feel relief. He felt resolve. Within days, arrangements were made. Temporary guardianship, approved supervision, clear boundaries, everything documented, everything deliberate. Gracie moved from waiting outside a fence to sitting inside Julian's life. At first, it was practical. Rides arranged, meals scheduled, school enrollment discussed. Julian treated it like a project. Steps, timelines, approvals. But projects didn't sit quietly at the kitchen counter doing homework. Projects didn't ask if they could pour their own juice. Projects didn't fall asleep on the couch during late evenings. Gracie did. One night, as Julian carried her to the guest room, she stirred slightly. "Thank you," she murmured. "For what?" he asked. "For letting me stay." Julian paused at the doorway. "You don't have to thank me," he said. "This is my responsibility now." The words settled heavily in the room. Responsibility. He had used the word often in his career. It had always meant obligation. For the first time, it meant something else entirely. Julian approached the legal process the same way he approached every major decision in his life. Methodically. There were meetings first. Quiet offices with neutral walls and steady voices. Questions asked, without judgment. Forms explained, line by line. Nothing rushed. Nothing assumed. Gracie sat beside him during most of those visits, feet barely touching the floor, hands folded in her lap. She listened more than she spoke. When asked questions directly, she answered clearly. "Do you know why you're here today?" a woman asked her gently. "Yes," Gracie said. "Because we're figuring things out." Julian glanced at her, surprised by how accurately she summarized the moment. The process required home visits, background checks, school confirmations. Julian complied with each request without hesitation. His life, usually guarded and private, opened piece by piece to careful review. Inspectors walked through his condo, noting spare rooms, safety measures, schedules. Julian answered questions he'd never been asked before. "Who helps you when work runs late?" "I adjust my schedule," he said. "What support system do you have?" "I'm building one," he replied honestly. At night, Julian read through documents long after Gracie fell asleep in the guest room. The language was precise. The responsibilities unmistakable. This wasn't a temporary arrangement. It was a commitment that reshaped everything. He told himself he was prepared. Still, doubt arrived quietly. One evening, as he reviewed a packet outlining long-term obligations, Julian set it aside and stared at the city lights beyond his window. His life had always been balanced by predictability. This choice disrupted that balance entirely. He thought of deadlines missed, projects delayed, evenings altered by school schedules and meals. Then he thought of Gracie, how she waited without complaint, how she trusted without demand, how she adapted without fear. The contrast was stark. The next morning, Julian drove her to school for the first time. She sat upright in the passenger seat, backpack secured, eyes focused forward. "You nervous?" he asked. She shook her head. "Are you?" He smiled faintly. "A little." "That's okay," she said. "My mom said, being nervous means you care." Julian didn't respond. He didn't need to. As weeks passed, the process moved steadily forward. Temporary arrangements shifted toward permanence. Each signature carried more weight than the last. During a final meeting, the attorney paused before sliding a document across the table. "This is the adoption decision," she said. "Once you sign, this becomes official." Julian held the pen without moving. He looked at Gracie, who sat quietly beside him, legs swinging slightly now. She wasn't watching the paper. She was watching him. "You don't have to," she said softly. Julian looked at her. "I know." Silence settled between them. Not tense, not urgent, just honest. He signed. The pen pressed firmly against the page. His name followed by the date. Clear, unmistakable. When the papers were collected, Julian felt no sudden rush of emotion, no dramatic shift. What he felt was grounding. On the walk back to the car, Gracie slipped her hand into his without asking. Julian noticed, but he didn't pull away. Later that night, Julian sat alone in his study, documents stacked neatly on the desk. The adoption papers rested at the top. He read through them once more, not out of uncertainty but recognition. This wasn't a role he had fallen into. This was a choice. And choices, Julian knew, carried meaning far beyond intention. As he turned off the lights and headed toward the guest room to check on Gracie, a thought settled into him with clarity. He had built structures his entire life. This time, he had built something that would grow. The word didn't come immediately. In the days after the papers were signed, nothing outwardly dramatic changed. Gracie still woke early. She still lined up her shoes neatly by the door. She still asked permission before touching anything that wasn't hers. Julian noticed everything. He noticed how she waited until he finished reading emails before speaking. He noticed how she watched him cook dinner, standing just close enough to feel included. He noticed how she listened more than she talked, absorbing routines as if learning a language. At school, teachers spoke well of her, focused, observant, kind. Julian attended meetings when his schedule allowed and rearranged it when it didn't. He learned drop-off patterns, pick-up times, homework expectations. At home, evenings settled into a rhythm. Dinner at the table, quiet conversation, occasional laughter that surprised them both. Still, Gracie called him Julian. The name didn't bother him. He hadn't expected anything else. Titles, he believed, should never be forced. Respect grew naturally or not at all. One evening, Julian worked late at the dining table, blueprints spread out while Gracie colored beside him. The city outside the window dimmed as lights flickered on across nearby buildings. "Can I ask you something?" she said. Julian looked up. "Of course. Do you like being responsible for me?" The question caught him off guard, not because it was emotional, but because it was direct. He considered it carefully. "Yes," he said finally. "I do." She nodded, accepting the answer without follow-up. A few minutes passed in comfortable silence. Then she asked, "Does it make you tired?" "Sometimes," Julian admitted. "But good things can be tiring." Gracie smiled at that. Later that night, after dishes were done and the apartment settled, Julian walked Gracie to her room. She climbed into bed, arranging her blanket with careful precision. "Can you stay until I fall asleep?" she asked. "Yes," Julian said. He sat in the chair beside her bed, reviewing notes on his tablet while the room quieted. Her breathing slowed gradually, steady and calm. Just as he stood to leave, Her voice broke the silence. "Daddy?" Julian froze. He turned slowly, unsure if he'd heard correctly. Gracie's eyes were half closed, her voice soft with sleep. "Can you turn the light off when you go?" Julian's throat tightened. He didn't correct her. He didn't ask her to repeat it. He simply nodded. Yes. He turned off the lamp and stood there for a moment longer than necessary, letting the room settle around them. In the hallway, Julian leaned briefly against the wall, breathing out slowly. The word echoed, not loudly, not dramatically, but with quiet permanence. Daddy. It wasn't a title he had imagined for himself. It wasn't something he had planned or prepared for. Yet it felt heavier than any role he'd ever accepted. The next morning, Gracie didn't mention it. She greeted him with a familiar good morning, poured her cereal, and sat at the table. Julian wondered if she even remembered saying it. But as he walked past her on his way to the sink, she spoke again. "Daddy," she said, more clearly this time. "I think I left my library book at school." Julian stopped. "Yes?" he replied, keeping his voice steady. "Can you help me remember next time?" He nodded. "I can." She smiled, satisfied, and returned to her breakfast. Julian stood there, momentarily still, as the weight of the moment settled fully. This wasn't a slip. This wasn't confusion. It was a choice she had made quietly, deliberately, in her own time. Later that day, Julian found himself distracted at work, not unfocused, but reflective. He caught his reflection in the glass of the site office window and hardly recognized the man staring back. He was the same architect, the same professional. But something fundamental had shifted. That evening, when Gracie introduced him to a classmate's parent, she didn't hesitate. "This is my dad," she said simply. Julian nodded in greeting, the word landing again with quiet force. Dad. No ceremony, no announcement, just truth spoken plainly. As they walked home together, Julian realized something that unsettled and steadied him all at once. He hadn't earned that title through biology or obligation. He had earned it through presence. And that, more than anything, changed the way he understood what it meant to belong. Julian didn't say the word out loud. He heard it often now, at breakfast, at school pickup, in passing moments that felt ordinary only because Gracie treated them that way. Each time she said it, the sound settled into him with the same quiet weight. Daddy. He carried it carefully, like something fragile that didn't need to be tested. At work, Julian returned to familiar rhythms. Meetings resumed their usual cadence. Drawings were revised. Timelines adjusted. To everyone else, nothing appeared different. But beneath the routine, his thinking had shifted. He stopped asking himself how this happened. Instead, he asked, what comes next? Late one evening, after Gracie had gone to bed, Julian sat alone in the living room. The city outside moved steadily, cars below, lights reflected against glass. He held a folder of documents he no longer needed to reread. Adoption papers, school records, medical forms, facts. He had always trusted facts. They were measurable, reliable, clean. Biology, he told himself, was just another fact. And facts didn't define commitment. Julian leaned back and closed his eyes, letting the silence settle. He thought of Gracie's calm presence at the construction site, her patience, her certainty. He thought of the way she had stepped into his life without force, without demands. She hadn't needed proof to trust him. Why should he need proof to love her? He had seen fathers walk away from children who shared their blood. He had seen parents remain distant despite biological ties. Those relationships hadn't failed because of lack of connection. They had failed because of lack of presence. Julian knew presence. Presence was showing up early, staying late, paying attention even when no one asked. He had done all of that already. In the weeks that followed, Julian settled into his role without announcement. He adjusted his schedule to match school hours. He learned what Gracie liked for breakfast and what she avoided without complaint. He learned which nights homework took longer and which evenings she needed quiet. Nothing about it felt forced. One afternoon, As they walked home from the park, Gracie spoke casually, eyes forward. "My teacher asked about my family tree today." Julian glanced at her. "What did you tell her?" "That I have a dad who builds buildings," she said, "and that he chose me." The word stayed with him. Chose. "Yes," Julian said. "That's right." She smiled faintly, satisfied, and continued walking. That night, Julian found himself revisiting old beliefs he had carried without question. The idea that family complicated success, that emotional ties created instability, that love introduced risk. He realized those beliefs had been convenient. They had protected him from vulnerability, from uncertainty, from needing anyone. Gracie had challenged all of that without argument. Julian didn't need a genetic link to feel responsibility toward her. He didn't need confirmation beyond the life they were already building. This was his family, not because of origin, but because of choice. As that understanding settled, Julian felt something unfamiliar but steady: peace. If this story is touching you already, comment family and keep watching. The next morning, Julian packed Gracie's lunch while she finished tying her shoes. "Daddy," she said, "can you come to my school thing next week?" "What kind of thing?" She shrugged. "We read out loud." Julian smiled. "I'll be there." She nodded, accepting the promise without question. As they stepped out into the day together, Julian understood something clearly. Biology could explain where someone came from, but it didn't explain why they stayed, and Julian Cross wasn't going anywhere. Gracie didn't grow up in isolation. Even as Julian's life remained structured and inward-facing, hers unfolded within a wider circle, one built on shared spaces, shared meals, and people who looked out for one another without needing invitations. It began quietly. Julian noticed it when neighbors started greeting Gracie by name in the hallway, when parents at school events leaned down to hug her without hesitation, when weekends filled themselves without being scheduled. Gracie's world extended beyond the walls of Julian's condo. She spent afternoons at friends' homes, backpacks tossed aside while homework spread across kitchen tables that smelled of food and conversation. She learned early how to move comfortably among adults, listening more than speaking, absorbing tone and rhythm the way she once absorbed routines at the construction site. Julian watched this from the edges. He drove her to birthday parties in neighborhoods he rarely visited. He waited in cars while laughter spilled out through open windows. He stood awkwardly at cookouts, greeted warmly by people who asked about his work, then asked about Gracie with more interest. "How's she doing in school? She's still reading ahead?" She always been that observant. Julian answered as best he could, slowly realizing something important. Gracie was known, not as his daughter, but as herself. She was part of a community that expected her presence and noticed her absence. A place where elders corrected gently, where neighbors checked in without announcement, where joy didn't need explanation. At school, Gracie thrived. Teachers described her as thoughtful and steady. She worked well in groups, often stepping back to let others speak before offering her own insight. Julian attended conferences and listened carefully, filing away every comment. "She's very grounded," one teacher said. "That usually comes from strong roots." Julian nodded, though he wasn't entirely sure what those roots were. At home, Gracie spoke easily about her friends, their families, their habits, their celebrations. Julian listened, sometimes struggling to follow the web of relationships she described. "So-and-so's aunt brings snacks," she explained once, "but only on Wednesdays." Julian smiled faintly. Of course, he noticed how Gracie adapted without effort. She knew when to laugh loudly and when to lower her voice. She understood respect not as obedience but as awareness of others. That awareness had been with her since the construction site. Julian began to recognize its origin here, in community. One evening, Gracie returned home later than usual, cheeks flushed from laughter. She kicked off her shoes by the door and dropped her backpack with a satisfied sigh. "You have fun?" Julian asked. "Yes," she said easily. "Miss Tasha taught us how to braid." Julian raised an eyebrow. "Did you learn?" Gracie shrugged. "I'm still practicing." Julian watched as she headed toward her room, humming softly. The sound lingered longer than expected. He realized something then, not with discomfort, but clarity. Gracie was becoming herself in ways he couldn't guide or control, and that was okay. In fact, it was necessary. Julian had given her stability. Her community gave her belonging. Those two things didn't compete. They balanced each other. That night, Julian sat on the couch longer than usual, reflecting on the quiet fullness of the day. He had built a life around structure and intent, yet Gracie's growth came from connection and continuity. It was a world he was still learning how to enter, and for the first time, he didn't feel the need to reshape it to fit his own. Sunday mornings didn't begin quietly in Gracie's world. They began with movement. Julian noticed it first in the way Gracie prepared the night before, laying out her clothes carefully, shoes placed side by side, hair ties gathered and ready. There was an energy to it that felt different from school mornings or weekday routines. "Why do you like Sundays so much?" Julian asked once. Gracie smiled. "Because everybody's there." Everybody turned out to be a lot of people. Julian drove them to church the first time without knowing what to expect. The building sat between rows of brick houses, modest in structure but alive in presence. People stood outside talking, laughing, greeting one another before the doors even opened. As soon as Gracie stepped out of the car, she was surrounded. "Gracie, baby, look how tall you're getting. Hug your auntie." Julian paused near the sidewalk, momentarily unsure where he belonged. Someone reached out and shook his hand warmly. "You must be her dad," a woman said, smiling. "We've heard about you." Julian nodded. "I'm Julian." "Well, Julian, you're welcome here." Inside, the space filled quickly. Voices rose together, not chaotic, but unified. Gracie slipped easily into a pew beside friends, whispering and laughing until the service began. Julian sat beside her, absorbing the experience quietly. This wasn't a place of formality or distance. It was shared presence. People responded aloud, nodded in agreement, clapped when moved. Children shifted and leaned against parents without reprimand. Gracie joined in naturally. She sang softly, not loudly. She listened closely. She closed her eyes when others did. Julian watched her from the corner of his eye, realizing that this environment shaped her in ways he never could. After service, the building didn't empty. It expanded. Tables appeared. Food followed. Conversations overlapped without urgency. Children moved freely, watched by many sets of eyes. Gracie introduced Julian to friends from school, neighbors, elders who corrected her gently when she forgot manners. "This is Mr. Julian," she said proudly. "He's my dad." The word landed again, but this time it wasn't private. It was public, accepted, affirmed without question. Julian nodded to greetings, answered questions, listened more than he spoke. He noticed how people asked Gracie about her week, her grades, her feelings, how her voice mattered in every exchange. Later that afternoon, as they walked home, Gracie skipped slightly ahead, her energy still high. "You okay?" Julian asked. "Yes," she said. "Church makes me feel strong." Julian considered that. Why? She thought for a moment. Because when things are hard, people help you stand. That idea stayed with him. During the week, Gracie's friendships filled the gaps between school and home. Sleepovers, group projects, shared snacks. Julian learned names slowly, recognizing voices before faces. One evening, Gracie came home upset, her shoulders slumped, her usual calm disturbed. "What happened?" Julian asked. "My friend said something mean," she replied quietly. Julian listened as she explained, not interrupting. When she finished, he waited. "What do you think?" he asked. She shrugged. "I think she was hurting too." Julian studied her carefully. "And what will you do?" "Still be kind," Gracie said, "but not let it change me." Julian felt a quiet pride settle in his chest. Resilience wasn't loud in Gracie. It wasn't dramatic. It lived in her steadiness, in her ability to feel without being consumed, in her capacity to forgive without erasing boundaries. Joy followed that resilience naturally. It appeared in small ways, dancing in the living room while music played from her phone, laughter echoing down the hallway during homework breaks, stories shared at dinner with animated gestures. Julian didn't always understand the references or rhythms, but he understood the result. Gracie was secure. Her world held space for struggle and celebration, without forcing a choice between them. One evening, Julian stood in the kitchen washing dishes, while Gracie laughed loudly on the couch, talking with friends on speaker. The sound filled the room, warm and unrestrained. He realized then that joy, like resilience, was something learned through connection. Gracie had learned it well. Not from structure alone, not from rules or schedules, but from people who showed up consistently and expected her to do the same. As Julian turned off the lights later that night, he felt gratitude, not possessive, not fearful, just steady. Gracie's world was wider than his, and that width gave her strength. As Gracie grew older, the difference between her world and Julian's became more visible, not in arguments but in moments that didn't quite align. Julian's life still followed structure. Meetings were scheduled weeks ahead. Evenings were planned. Silence was something he valued, especially after long days filled with decisions that carried weight. Gracie's world didn't work that way. Her phone buzzed often. Friends stopped by without notice. Conversations overlapped. Laughter came suddenly and left just as quickly. There was rhythm to it, but not the kind Julian was used to managing. At first, Julian tried to organize it. What time will they be here? How long are they staying? Who's picking everyone up? Gracie answered patiently, but her responses were rarely precise. I don't know yet, she'd say. We'll figure it out. That answer used to unsettle Julian. He liked clarity. He trusted predictability. But Gracie moved easily in uncertainty, and her friends did too. They adapted in real time, adjusting plans without stress. One evening, Julian hosted a small dinner for colleagues, people he'd worked with for years. The apartment was quiet, controlled, polished. Conversations stayed light and professional. Gracie joined them briefly, greeting everyone politely before excusing herself to her room. Later, as Julian cleaned up, he noticed her watching from the hallway. Everything okay? He asked. Yes, she replied. They're just different, Julian nodded. They are. A pause settled between them. I don't think they'd understand my friends, Gracie added gently. Julian considered that. I don't always understand them either. She smiled at that. The tension wasn't about disagreement. It was about space. Gracie's world was expressive. Julian's was contained. Neither was wrong, but they didn't always fit neatly together. At school events, Julian noticed it more clearly. Other parents greeted Gracie with ease, joking and teasing. Julian joined in when he could, but sometimes he felt like an observer instead of a participant. Still, Gracie never tried to choose between worlds. She invited Julian into hers without pressure, asking him to attend community events, school programs and gatherings that mattered to her. When he came, she never expected him to change, just to be present. And Julian learned. He learned to sit longer than felt comfortable, to listen without redirecting, to accept noise as connection, not disruption. One afternoon, after a long day at work, Julian returned home to find the living room full. Gracie and her friends sat cross-legged on the floor, books spread out, music playing softly. Julian hesitated at the doorway. Gracie looked up. We're studying, she said quickly. Julian surveyed the scene. It wasn't quiet. It wasn't orderly, but it was focused. Carry on, he said. Later, after everyone left, Julian admitted something he hadn't before. I'm still learning your world, he told her. Gracie nodded. That's okay. I'm learning yours too. That balance mattered. Julian realized the tension wasn't a threat to their relationship. It was a bridge being built, one conversation at a time. Gracie didn't ask about her mother often. When she did, it was indirect. She'd pause during a movie when a character mentioned a mom. She'd linger over old photos longer than expected. She'd ask questions that seemed unrelated but weren't. What do you remember about when I was little? She asked one evening. Julian answered carefully. You were quiet, observant. You noticed things. Gracie nodded, satisfied, but not fully. There were gaps in her story she felt but couldn't name. At school, assignments about family history surfaced occasionally. Gracie completed them neatly, focusing on what she knew. Julian noticed how she avoided certain sections without complaint. One night, while folding laundry together, Gracie spoke again. "Do you think people are born knowing everything about themselves?" Julian paused. "No. I think we learn as we go." "What if some things are missing?" she asked. "Then we keep living," he said. "And sometimes the answers find us." Gracie absorbed that quietly. She didn't push. She never demanded information Julian didn't have or wasn't ready to share. Her questions lived beneath the surface, patient and unresolved. Julian felt the weight of those silences. He knew Gracie's mother only through brief conversations and limited context. He respected the boundaries that had been set. Still, he sensed Gracie's curiosity growing, not urgently, but steadily. One afternoon, Julian found Gracie looking through an old school file. "What's that?" he asked. "My paperwork," she said. "It has my old address." Julian sat beside her. "Do you want to talk about it?" She shook her head. "Not yet." Julian nodded. He understood that answer now. Later that night, Julian reflected on how much Gracie carried quietly. Her strength wasn't just in resilience or joy. It was in patience with unanswered questions. She wasn't searching recklessly. She was waiting. Julian felt protective in a new way, not of her safety, but of her timing. Whatever truth existed about her past, it wasn't his to rush. It would come when it was ready. For now, Gracie lived fully in the present, laughing with friends, growing into herself, rooted in a community that held her steady. And Julian stayed beside her, committed not to filling every gap, but to walking with her as she discovered who she was. Gracie didn't rush adulthood. It arrived gradually, shaped by routines, responsibility, and the steady confidence she had carried since childhood. College took her just far enough from home to grow independently, but close enough that Julian could still attend important moments without rearranging his entire life. She studied with focus, worked part-time, built friendships that lasted beyond semesters. Her calm presence remained her signature, never loud, never invisible. Julian watched her grow with a mix of pride and restraint. He didn't hover. He didn't interfere. He stayed available. Gracie appreciated that balance. She checked in often, sometimes just to talk through small decisions. Other times, she simply wanted to hear his voice at the end of a long day. Their relationship had settled into something steady and mutual. When Gracie met Evan, it wasn't dramatic. There was no sweeping moment or instant certainty. He entered her life through shared space, community events, mutual friends, overlapping routines. He was thoughtful, observant, and patient in ways Gracie recognized immediately. He listened more than he spoke. He noticed details others missed. He respected silence without trying to fill it. Gracie trusted that. Julian met Evan for the first time over dinner at the condo. The conversation stayed polite, measured, careful. Julian asked practical questions. Evan answered honestly, without exaggeration. Afterward, Julian asked Gracie what she thought. "I feel safe with him," she said simply. That answer mattered. Gracie and Evan built their relationship quietly. They took time. They learned each other's habits before making promises. Disagreements were handled without raised voices, resolved through conversation rather than distance. Gracie valued that deeply. She had grown up understanding the power of presence. She chose someone who showed up consistently rather than impressively. Years passed without urgency. When Gracie decided she wanted more, a family, a home filled with life, it wasn't because of expectation. It was because she felt ready. Julian sensed the shift before she said anything. She lingered longer during visits, asked questions about balancing responsibility and joy, watched families in public spaces with quiet attention. One evening, as they sat together after dinner, she spoke. "I want children someday," she said. Julian nodded. "You'll be a good mother." She smiled faintly. "I hope so. You already know how to wait," he replied, "and how to care without controlling. That matters." Gracie took that in. Her decision to become a mother didn't change her identity, it expanded it. She prepared carefully. She planned with Evan. They discussed support, schedules, values. Nothing was assumed. When Gracie became pregnant, she told Julian first. He listened without interruption, letting her speak at her own pace. When she finished, he reached across the table and held her hand. "I'm here," he said. That was all she needed. Pregnancy brought change, but not chaos. Gracie adjusted her work, leaned on community, accepted help without feeling diminished by it. Evan remained steady, present in appointments and late-night conversations alike. Julian attended where invited. He respected boundaries where needed. He learned his role again, support without intrusion. Gracie stepped into motherhood the same way she stepped into everything else, with intention. She didn't romanticize it. She prepared for fatigue, uncertainty, and sacrifice. She also made space for joy, small celebrations, shared laughter, moments that didn't need documentation to matter. As her life filled with new purpose, Julian noticed something quietly profound. Gracie wasn't becoming someone else. She was becoming more herself. The calm child who once waited patiently outside a construction site had grown into a woman who understood timing, trust, and commitment deeply. And as Gracie's life expanded, Julian felt his own role shift once more, readying him for something he hadn't yet named. Motherhood didn't arrive for Gracie all at once. It came in waves, first as anticipation, then as responsibility, and finally as love that rearranged everything without asking permission. Her daughter arrived on a quiet spring morning. The hospital room was calm, filled with soft conversation and focused movement. Gracie was steady through the long hours, breathing through discomfort with the same patience she had carried since childhood. Evan stayed close, offering reassurance without overwhelming her. When the baby finally cried, Gracie closed her eyes and let the sound settle into her chest. Julian arrived shortly after, standing just inside the doorway at first, unsure how much space to take. Gracie looked up and smiled. "Come meet her," she said. Julian stepped forward carefully, as if approaching something sacred. When Gracie placed her daughter in his arms, he felt the weight immediately. Not heavy, but meaningful. "She's calm," he said quietly. Gracie smiled. "She's observant." Julian nodded. He recognized that quality. The first years were demanding. Sleep came in fragments. Days blurred together. Gracie learned quickly that motherhood required flexibility more than preparation. Her daughter grew curious early, watching faces closely, responding to tone before words. Gracie nurtured that curiosity gently, encouraging exploration without pressure. Julian visited often, adjusting his schedule without complaint. He learned how to hold a baby properly, how to warm bottles, how to rock gently without rushing the moment. 9 years later, when Gracie welcomed her son, the experience felt different. She was more confident now, less fearful of mistakes. She understood that love didn't require perfection, only presence. Her son arrived with urgency, his cry loud and immediate. Gracie laughed through exhaustion, holding him close as if grounding herself in the moment. Julian stood nearby again, older now, but just as attentive. "He's strong," Julian said. Gracie smiled tiredly. "He already knows what he wants." Life settled into a new rhythm. School mornings filled with backpacks and reminders. Evenings balanced homework, dinner, and conversation. Gracie moved through it all with quiet competence, leaning on community and family without hesitation. Her children grew surrounded by voices, stories, and shared care. They knew who they belonged to, and Julian, watching from just a step behind, understood that something enduring was taking shape. Julian never hesitated when it came to Gracie's children. From the beginning, he showed up. He attended school events without being asked. He learned schedules, preferences, and routines. He kept spare clothes in his car and snacks in his briefcase. The children knew him simply as Grandpa. To Gracie's daughter, Julian was a quiet constant, someone who listened carefully and answered questions thoughtfully. She liked sitting beside him, asking about buildings and cities, absorbing information the way Gracie once had. To Gracie's son, Julian was warmth and patience. He knelt to eye level. He let conversations wander. He followed interests rather than directing them. Julian adjusted his life without resentment. Meetings were scheduled around recitals. Deadlines shifted to make room for school pickups. Colleagues noticed but didn't comment. Julian didn't explain. He didn't need to. On weekends, his condo filled with movement again. Toys appeared in corners. Drawings taped to the refrigerator. Laughter echoed off walls once known for silence. Julian didn't miss the quiet. He learned to read stories aloud, to sit through games he didn't fully understand, to let moments unfold without managing them. Gracie watched him sometimes, struck by how naturally he inhabited the role. "You're good at this," she said once. Julian smiled faintly. "I'm learning." He took pride in watching the children grow, not in shaping them, but in supporting who they already were. He corrected gently, praised honestly, showed up consistently. Julian realized something during those years. This love came without effort, not because it was simple, but because it was chosen daily. And choice, Julian had learned, carried more weight than obligation. For a long time, life felt settled. Gracie balanced work and motherhood with care. Her children thrived, curious, grounded, surrounded by people who noticed them. Julian's role remained steady, supportive, reliable. They built traditions, Sunday dinners, school celebrations, quiet evenings, where nothing extraordinary happened. Those moments mattered most. Julian often reflected on how far they had come. From a construction site to a family rooted in shared care, he felt grateful, not triumphant, peaceful, not complacent. Yet beneath the calm, small disruptions began to surface. Gracie's daughter grew tired more easily. Teachers mentioned difficulty concentrating. Gracie noticed changes she couldn't explain. Doctor visits followed, tests ordered, answers delayed. Julian stayed composed, reassuring where he could. He trusted routines, trusted professionals, trusted that time would resolve uncertainty. But Gracie felt it differently. She watched her daughter closely, asked questions, kept notes. One evening, as they sat together after putting the children to bed, Gracie spoke quietly. "Something feels off." Julian nodded. "We'll figure it out." They didn't know then how much that promise would demand. For now, life continued. Morning routines, homework at the table, laughter in familiar rooms. Peace held, but it thinned slightly, enough to notice, not enough to panic. Julian sensed it too, a shift he couldn't yet name. The family stood on the edge of something unseen, unaware that the calm they cherished was about to be tested in ways none of them had prepared for. It began with small changes that were easy to dismiss. Gracie noticed first because she paid attention the way she always had. Her daughter, now 9, moved a little slower in the mornings. She asked to rest after school instead of rushing outside to play. She complained of headaches that came and went without pattern. At first, Gracie adjusted routines, earlier bedtimes, more water, lighter afternoons. Children went through phases. Growth spurts caused fatigue. School could be demanding. Gracie reminded herself of all the reasonable explanations and moved carefully, watching without alarm. Julian noticed too, though he didn't say anything at first. During one of his regular visits, he watched his granddaughter push food around her plate, appetite half gone. She smiled when he asked how school was, but the smile faded faster than usual. "You okay?" he asked gently. She nodded. "Just tired, Grandpa." Julian accepted the answer, but he remembered it. Weeks passed, and the signs didn't disappear. Gracie's daughter missed a school day for the first time that year, then another. Teachers called with concern, not urgent, but consistent. "She seems distracted," one said. Not herself. Gracie scheduled a doctor's appointment. The pediatrician listened carefully, asked questions, ordered basic tests. Nothing dramatic. "Just caution. We'll start here," the doctor said. "It's probably something minor." Gracie nodded, relieved but unconvinced. At home, she watched her daughter closely. The child still laughed, still did homework, still curled up beside her brother to watch cartoons. But her energy no longer carried her through the day. One evening, as Gracie tucked her into bed, her daughter spoke softly. "Mommy, why do I feel heavy?" Gracie paused. "Heavy how?" "Like, my body doesn't want to move sometimes." Gracie swallowed. "We're going to make sure you're okay." The next round of appointments followed quickly. Blood work, follow-up visits, more questions. Julian attended when he could, sitting quietly in waiting rooms, watching families move through similar spaces with similar uncertainty. He noticed how Gracie held herself, steady on the outside, vigilant underneath. "You don't have to come every time," Gracie told him once. "I want to," Julian replied. At school, Gracie's daughter stopped participating in recess. Teachers adjusted expectations gently. Friends asked questions she didn't always know how to answer. "Are you sick?" one asked. "I don't know," she replied honestly. At home, her brother noticed too. "She sleeps a lot," he said one afternoon. Gracie knelt beside him. "Sometimes people need more rest. Is she going to be okay?" Gracie met his eyes. "We're taking care of her." Julian watched that exchange from the kitchen, feeling something tighten in his chest. He had lived long enough to recognize when something was shifting beneath the surface. One morning, Gracie received a call while making breakfast. She stepped into the hallway to take it, voice low, controlled. When she returned, Julian noticed the change immediately. "What did they say?" he asked. "They want more tests," Gracie replied. "Soon." Julian nodded. "I'll come." Gracie didn't respond right away. She focused on pouring juice, steadying her hands. Later that evening, when the children were asleep, Gracie finally spoke what she had been holding back. "I feel like I'm waiting for something I don't want to hear." Julian sat beside her. "We'll handle it together." The following week, the fatigue worsened. Gracie's daughter struggled to climb stairs. She grew pale more often. The joy that once came easily now took effort. At another appointment, the doctor's tone changed. Still calm, but more deliberate. "We're seeing patterns we need to take seriously," he said. "I want to refer you to a specialist." Gracie nodded slowly. Julian asked the questions Gracie couldn't yet form. "What does that mean?" "It means we don't guess anymore," the doctor replied. "We investigate." As they left the office, Gracie held her daughter's hand tightly. "I don't like this," the child said quietly. Gracie bent down to her level. "I know, but you're not alone." Julian watched them, feeling the weight of a role he had stepped into long ago without fully realizing how deep it would go. This wasn't a passing concern anymore. Something real had arrived, and none of them yet knew how far it would reach. The specialist's office felt quieter than the others. Not silent, just deliberate. Voices lowered, movements slower. Gracie noticed it the moment they sat down. Her daughter swung her legs gently from the exam table, watching the adults with careful eyes. The doctor reviewed charts without rushing. He asked Gracie's daughter simple questions first. How she felt in the mornings, whether food tasted different, how often she felt tired. She answered honestly, glancing at Gracie for reassurance only once. Gracie listened, hands folded tightly in her lap. When the doctor finally spoke, his tone was clear and steady. "The tests show reduced kidney function." Gracie inhaled slowly. "Reduced? How much?" "Enough that we need to act," he replied. "We're not speculating anymore." Julian leaned forward. "What does that mean long term?" "It means we confirm what's happening and support her body while we plan next steps." More tests followed. Imaging, consultations, words that sounded technical but carried weight. Monitoring, progression, management. By the end of the day, they had a diagnosis. Kidney failure. The word didn't land loudly. It settled. Gracie nodded through explanations, absorbing details the way she always had, calm on the surface, alert underneath. She asked about timelines, about school, about daily life. "What changes now?" she asked. "Some routines will change," the doctor said. "Diet, activity, appointments. We'll take this step by step." At home that evening, Gracie's daughter sat quietly at the table, coloring while her brother built towers beside her. "Am I really sick?" she asked suddenly. Gracie knelt in front of her. "Your kidneys need help," she said gently. "So we're going to help them. Will it hurt?" Gracie didn't lie. "Some things might be uncomfortable, but we'll be with you." Julian watched, feeling the weight of every word. That night, after the children were asleep, the house felt too still. Gracie sat at the table, papers spread out, eyes scanning lines she wished she didn't understand. Julian made tea and placed a mug in front of her. "I'm here," he said again. Gracie nodded. "I know." They didn't speak for a while. There was nothing to add yet. The truth had arrived. Life reorganized itself around appointments. Early mornings at the hospital, afternoons waiting on calls, evenings balancing homework and exhaustion. Gracie learned the layout of medical floors the way she once learned neighborhoods, where to sit, who to ask, how to wait. Her daughter adapted bravely. She learned to sit still during blood draws. She answered nurses politely. She carried a small notebook where she drew while waiting. Julian took on logistics without discussion. Transportation, meals, childcare for Gracie's son during longer appointments. He handled the background so Gracie could focus on the foreground. Still, the weight grew heavier. The hospital became familiar, the rhythm of doors opening and closing, the quiet hum of machines, the patience required for every answer. One afternoon, Gracie overheard another parent speaking softly nearby. They said transplant might be the only option. The words followed her down the hallway. Later that week, the doctor confirmed it. "We can manage symptoms for a time," he explained, "but eventually she'll need a transplant." Gracie nodded. "How long do we have?" "It varies," he said honestly. "We prepare now." Julian asked the next question. "What do we do first?" "We start the donor search." The word search carried urgency Gracie couldn't ignore. That night, she sat on the edge of her daughter's bed. "Mummy," her daughter asked, "am I going to be okay?" Gracie brushed her hair back. "We're doing everything we can. Promise?" Gracie paused, then nodded. "I promise to never stop trying." The days blurred. Some mornings felt hopeful, others didn't. Gracie learned how to carry both without letting either take control. Julian noticed the toll in small ways. Gracie forgetting to eat, pausing mid-sentence, staring too long at nothing. He stepped closer, not to fix, but to hold space. "You don't have to be strong all the time," he told her once. "I know," she said, "but I will be." The donor process began with optimism. Family members were tested, friends volunteered, names were added and removed from lists. Each call brought anticipation and often disappointment. "Incompatible," the coordinator said again. Gracie learned to nod through it, to thank people who tried, to reassure others who felt guilty for results they couldn't control. Weeks passed, then months. The list grew shorter, the options narrowed. Julian watched the process carefully, saying little but noticing everything. He saw how Gracie kept her daughter's spirits up, celebrating small victories, good days, strong moments, laughter that arrived unexpectedly. But at night, when the house quieted, the strain surfaced. "I don't know what else to do," Gracie admitted one evening. Julian sat beside her. "We keep going." Another call came. Another no. Gracie closed her eyes briefly, then reopened them. "Okay," she said. "What's next?" The coordinator hesitated. "We continue searching." Julian felt a decision forming before he spoke it. "I'll get tested," he said. Gracie turned sharply. "Dad." "I want to," he said gently. "Let me." She studied him, conflict crossing her face. "You don't have to." "I know," he replied. "But I'm here." Gracie didn't answer right away. Later that night, she stood in the doorway of his study. "Thank you," she said quietly. Julian nodded. "Always." As the donor search pressed on, the family learned to live in uncertainty, planning days around possibility, preparing for outcomes they couldn't predict. They held on to routine because it anchored them. And still, the question lingered. What if the answer didn't come in time? Julian didn't announce his decision. There was no dramatic moment, no speech, no attempt to prepare anyone for it. He simply made the call. It happened on a Tuesday morning, after dropping Gracie's son at school and before heading into the office. Julian pulled his car to the side of the road, engines still running, and dialed the transplant coordinator's number from memory. "I'd like to begin donor testing," he said when the call connected. The woman on the other end paused. "May I ask your relationship to the patient?" "I'm her grandfather," Julian replied. There was another pause, longer this time. "We'll need to review eligibility requirements with you." "I understand," Julian said. "Tell me what to do." The process moved quickly after that. Paperwork arrived by email. Appointments were scheduled. Instructions were clear and unemotional. Julian appreciated that. He preferred systems that didn't require persuasion. He didn't tell Gracie right away, not because he doubted the decision, but because he wanted it to be settled before it became a conversation. He had learned over time that Gracie didn't respond well to uncertainty presented as reassurance. She trusted actions more than promises. Julian completed preliminary questionnaires late that night. Medical history, lifestyle habits, family background. He answered each question carefully, aware that accuracy mattered more than optimism. When he reached the section about motivation, he paused. "Why do you want to donate?" Julian stared at the screen longer than he expected. "Because it's my responsibility," he almost typed. But that wasn't true, not fully. He erased the words and wrote instead, "Because she deserves every chance possible." The next appointment took place at the same hospital Gracie's daughter visited regularly. Julian arrived early, checked in quietly, and waited without distraction. A nurse called his name and led him through familiar corridors. Julian noticed how routine the process felt to him now. The sounds, the smells, the cadence of medical spaces. Blood was drawn. Vitals taken. Questions asked again, this time aloud. "Do you understand the risks?" the doctor asked. "Yes." "Are you being pressured in any way?" "No." "Would you still want to proceed if you're not a match?" Julian didn't hesitate. "Yes." The doctor nodded, noting his response. Julian returned home later that afternoon and found Gracie in the kitchen, reviewing notes from the hospital. She looked up as he entered, reading his expression instinctively. "You were at the hospital," she said. Julian nodded. "I started the donor process." Gracie froze. "Dad," she said slowly, "you don't have to do that." Julian met her gaze evenly. "I know. You're not obligated. I'm aware." She set her pen down, emotion rising despite her effort to remain calm. "This isn't something you should feel responsible for." Julian stepped closer. "I don't feel responsible," he said. "I feel willing." Gracie searched his face for doubt and found none. "This is my choice," he continued, "just like everything else that's mattered." Silence settled between them. Finally, Gracie exhaled. "Thank you," she said quietly. "But I don't want you to get your hopes up." Julian nodded. "Neither do I." That evening, Julian sat with his grandchildren as usual. He helped with homework, listened to stories, watched cartoons he didn't fully understand. Nothing about the moment felt heavy. Later, as Gracie's daughter climbed into bed, she looked up at him. "Grandpa," she asked, "are you coming with me to the hospital tomorrow?" Julian smiled. "Yes." She nodded, comforted. As Julian turned off the light, he felt something steady settle into place. This wasn't sacrifice, it was continuity. The following days passed with measured calm. More tests were scheduled, more questions asked. Julian complied without complaint, adjusting his work schedule as needed. Colleagues noticed the changes. "Everything okay?" one asked. Julian nodded. Just priorities shifting. At night, Julian reflected on the decision without fear. He didn't imagine outcomes. He didn't dwell on risks. He focused on what he could control, being present, being honest, being available. He had built his life on intention. This was no different. What Julian didn't know, what none of them knew yet, was that the choice he made so quietly was already beginning to reveal something far larger than compatibility, something that would reach back through years they thought were settled. For now, Julian Cross waited. Calm, certain, unaware that the tests he had agreed to would soon challenge everything he believed he understood about his family. The first sign that something was different came without warning. Julian sat in a small consultation room, hands folded loosely in his lap, as a nurse reviewed preliminary results on a tablet. She scrolled once, then again, her expression tightening just enough to notice. "I'm going to step out for a moment," she said, polite but purposeful. Julian nodded. He had learned to read these pauses. They rarely meant panic, but they never meant nothing. When the doctor entered, his tone remained calm, professional. He greeted Julian, then sat down without opening the file immediately. "Your initial compatibility results are unusual," he said. Julian tilted his head slightly. "Unusual how?" The doctor turned the screen toward him. "Your tissue markers align more closely than we typically see in extended family donations." Julian absorbed the information without reacting. "Is that a problem?" "Not necessarily," the doctor replied. "It just means we need to take a closer look." Julian nodded. "Whatever you need." The doctor studied him briefly. "You understand that deeper alignment usually appears in closer biological relationships." Julian met his gaze. "I understand." At home later that evening, Julian mentioned the update casually while helping Gracie prepare dinner. "They want to run more tests," he said. Gracie paused mid-chop. "Why?" "They noticed stronger compatibility than expected." Her hand stilled. "Is that bad?" Julian shook his head. "They didn't say that. Just thorough." Gracie nodded slowly, though something in her expression shifted. She didn't press further. Neither did he. Over the next few days, Julian returned to the hospital for additional blood work. Each visit felt more focused than the last, more deliberate. Staff spoke carefully now, choosing words that suggested attention without explanation. Julian remained composed, but a quiet awareness began to settle in. This wasn't routine. The call came early. "Mr. Cross," the coordinator said, "we'd like to schedule additional testing as soon as possible." Julian checked his calendar. Today works. At the hospital, the atmosphere felt different, less procedural, more investigative. Consent forms were reviewed again. Explanations repeated with added emphasis. "We want to rule out anomalies," the doctor said. "This doesn't change your eligibility to donate." "What does it change?" Julian asked. "It changes how carefully we interpret the results." Julian agreed without hesitation. As samples were collected, Julian found himself thinking not about the procedure, but about timing. About how long Gracie had waited outside that construction site years ago. About how patience had shaped her life. When the doctor returned, he didn't sit immediately. "We're expanding the panel," he said. "Including genetic markers." Julian's breath slowed. "Is that standard?" "In cases like this," the doctor replied. Julian nodded. "Do it." At home that night, Gracie noticed his quiet. "You okay?" she asked. "Yes," Julian said. Then, after a pause, "They're being thorough." Gracie studied him. "Thorough usually means they found something." Julian didn't answer immediately. "It means they want to be certain." She accepted that, for now. Over the next week, the waiting stretched. No calls, no updates. The house carried its normal rhythm, but beneath it, anticipation built. Julian felt it most when he was alone, late at night, staring at city lights, replaying years he believed he understood. He didn't yet know what the tests would reveal, but he sensed that whatever it was, it reached backward as much as forward. The call came on a Thursday afternoon. "Mr. Cross," the doctor said, voice measured. "We need you to come in." Julian didn't ask why. He arrived within the hour. Gracie joined him this time, sitting beside him in the consultation room, fingers laced tightly together. The doctor entered with a file in hand and closed the door gently behind him. "We completed the expanded testing," he began. Julian nodded. "And?" The doctor took a breath. "The compatibility isn't coincidental." Gracie's grip tightened. "You're not just compatible as a donor," the doctor continued. "The results indicate a direct biological relationship." The room went still. Gracie looked from the doctor to Julian, confusion flickering across her face. "What does that mean?" The doctor chose his words carefully. It means the genetic alignment suggests Mr. Cross is not a grandparent by chance. Julian felt the weight of the moment settle into his chest, heavy but clear. He's her biological grandfather, the doctor said. Gracie's breath caught. That's not possible. The doctor opened the file and slid it across the table. The data is consistent across multiple markers. Gracie shook her head slowly. You're saying that your mother, the doctor finished gently, is Mr. Cross's biological daughter. Silence followed. Julian didn't speak. He didn't move. Years rearranged themselves in his mind, moments he had accepted without question now demanding re-evaluation. Gracie stared at the file, eyes scanning words she barely registered. My mother is your... Her voice broke. Julian reached for her hand instinctively. The doctor continued softly. This doesn't change the donation process, but it does explain the compatibility. Gracie pulled her hand back, not in anger, but shock. My mom never said... Julian's voice was steady, though his chest felt tight. I didn't know. The doctor nodded. That's clear. Gracie stood slowly, pacing once, then stopping. So the man I thought adopted me. Julian rose with her. Gracie. She turned to him, eyes searching his face. You're my father. The words landed without drama, without accusation, just truth. Julian nodded. It appears so. Gracie pressed a hand to her mouth, tears forming despite her effort to remain composed. The doctor gave them space. Take the time you need. We'll talk about next steps when you're ready. As the door closed, father and daughter stood facing each other in a room that suddenly held decades of unanswered questions. Julian spoke first. I would have stayed, he said quietly. I would have wanted to know. Gracie nodded, tears falling now. I know. They stood there, holding the truth between them, heavy, devastating, clarifying. The test that Julian volunteered for had done more than prepare him to save his granddaughter's life. It had uncovered the origin of his family, and nothing would ever be the same again. The truth didn't arrive all at once. It came through files, dates, signatures, and questions that required patience to answer. After the consultation room emptied, and the shock settled into a quiet ache, Julian and Gracie agreed on one thing without discussion. They needed confirmation that didn't rely on assumptions. Facts mattered. The hospital initiated the process. Records were requested formally. Birth certificates, admission logs, archived patient files from years earlier. Gracie signed forms with steady hands, though her breath stayed shallow. Julian stood beside her, reading each line carefully, ensuring nothing was rushed. This may take time, the records coordinator said. Some files are archived, off-site. Gracie nodded. That's fine. Waiting had never been foreign to her. Days passed without updates. Life continued in fragments, school drop-offs, hospital visits, quiet meals. Gracie's daughter asked fewer questions now, sensing the weight in the room even when no one spoke. Julian noticed how Gracie carried herself differently, still composed but guarded, as if the ground beneath her had shifted and she was learning how to stand again. The call came late one afternoon. We've located the records, the coordinator said. You'll need to come in. Julian drove. Gracie sat in the passenger seat, staring out the window, hands clasped together. Neither spoke during the drive. Inside the records office, a folder waited on the desk, thicker than expected. The coordinator opened it slowly, explaining each document as she went. This admission date matches the year you were born, she said, sliding one page forward. And this lists the mother's name. Gracie leaned in. The name meant nothing to her at first. She blinked, reading it again. That doesn't sound familiar. Julian's chest tightened. He recognized it immediately, not as something current, but as something buried. This section, the coordinator continued, unaware of the weight settling in the room, lists next of kin at the time. No father recorded. Gracie swallowed. There's nothing else. There's more, the coordinator said gently. Follow-up notes, postnatal care, discharge summary. Julian reached out, steadying the edge of the folder as Gracie turned pages. Each line added clarity without comfort. The address listed matched an area Julian had lived in briefly years ago. The timeline aligned with a period he rarely revisited: busy, transitional, emotionally distant. "This can't be coincidence," Gracie said quietly. Julian didn't respond. He was reading something else now. A note near the back of the file, handwritten, dated weeks after Gracie's birth. "Patient declined to list father. State's decision intentional." Julian exhaled slowly. The coordinator hesitated. "There's also a death certificate attached." Gracie looked up sharply. "Death?" The coordinator nodded. "Several years later. Cause listed as complications from illness." Gracie felt the room tilt. "She's gone," she whispered. Julian closed his eyes briefly. The search for answers had delivered something heavier than either of them expected. The coordinator offered water, offered time, stepped out quietly. Gracie stared at the documents, her mind racing through memories that suddenly felt incomplete. "My mother," she said, voice barely audible, "never came back." Julian sat beside her. "I didn't know," he said again. Not defensively, not as explanation, just truth. Gracie nodded, tears forming despite her effort to remain composed. She carried this alone. Julian felt the weight of that realization settle fully now. Whatever reasons had guided the past, they had led here, into a room filled with paper evidence and emotional consequence. The records didn't accuse. They didn't explain motives. They simply confirmed what had been hidden. As Gracie gathered the folder and stood to leave, she paused. "So, this is how it starts," she said quietly. "With paperwork," Julian nodded. "And with patience." They walked out together, carrying the truth not as a conclusion, but as the beginning of something neither of them yet knew how to name. Julian didn't speak for most of the drive home. Gracie watched the city move past the windows, street by street, her thoughts colliding with a past she had never been allowed to touch. The name from the file repeated in her mind, unfamiliar yet heavy. At home, Julian placed the folder on the dining table and opened it again, this time slower. He wasn't searching for proof anymore. He was tracing memory. "There was someone," he said finally. Gracie looked up. "A long time ago," Julian continued, choosing each word carefully. "Before my career took over everything." He leaned back in his chair, eyes distant. "We met during a transition period in my life. I was moving between projects, traveling often, not grounded." Gracie listened without interruption. "She was thoughtful," Julian said. "Private. She didn't demand attention. I mistook that for independence." He paused, swallowing. "We weren't together long." Gracie's voice was steady. "Did you love her?" Julian considered the question honestly. "I cared for her, but I didn't build space for her." Silence settled between them. "She never told me she was pregnant," Julian said. "And I never thought to ask." Gracie closed her eyes briefly. The realization didn't arrive as anger. It arrived as grief. Grief for time that had moved on without correction. "She named me," Gracie said softly, recalling the record. Julian nodded. "She always planned ahead." They sat there, two adults learning a shared history neither had chosen to hide, yet both had lived with its consequences. The truth wasn't dramatic. It was devastating in its simplicity. Gracie didn't cry immediately. The confirmation of her mother's death arrived quietly, printed in black ink at the bottom of a page. No fanfare, no explanation beyond dates and a cause that felt distant and final. "She never reached out," Gracie said eventually. Julian shook his head. "She never contacted me." They both understood what that meant. Her mother had made a decision, not out of malice, but resolve. "She carried this alone," Gracie whispered. Julian nodded. "And protected you the only way she knew how." That truth shifted something inside Gracie. She thought of her childhood, waiting, observing, trusting. She thought of the woman who had believed her daughter would find her way without interference. "She trusted me," Gracie said. Julian felt the weight of that trust settle heavily. "She trusted both of us." Gracie stood and walked to the window, pressing her forehead lightly against the glass. "I wish I could ask her why." Julian joined her. "I wish I could tell her I would have stayed." They stood together, grief layered with understanding. Her mother hadn't disappeared. She had endured quietly and left behind a life that found its way home anyway. The collapse came later, not in the hospital, not during the discovery. It came at home, after the children were asleep, when the house finally grew quiet. Gracie sat on the floor, back against the couch, the folder open beside her. Julian watched her shoulders shake before she made a sound. "I didn't know who I was missing," she said through tears. "Now I do." Julian sat beside her without speaking, letting the moment unfold. "I had a mother," Gracie said, "and she never came back." Julian's voice was low. "She never left you." Gracie looked up, eyes searching his face. "She trusted you to grow," he continued, "and she trusted me to be there when it mattered, even if she didn't know how." Gracie's breath hitched. "You were always there," Julian nodded, "because I chose you. Every day." Gracie leaned into him then, the strength she had carried for years finally giving way. Julian held her as she cried, not as the man who had adopted her, but as the father who had been there all along. "I don't blame you," Gracie said quietly after a while. Julian closed his eyes. "I blame myself." She pulled back, meeting his gaze. "Then don't. Not alone." They sat there, the truth no longer a secret, but a shared weight. Reconciliation didn't erase the past. It reframed it. Gracie understood now why her mother had been silent. Julian understood what he had missed. And together they acknowledged something deeper than regret. Family didn't begin with biology, but sometimes biology explained why love had arrived so naturally in the first place. As the night wore on, Gracie stood and wiped her face. "We still have a child to save," she said. Julian nodded, resolve firming. "And we will." The truth had shaken them. But it had also anchored them more deeply than ever before. Julian didn't hesitate once the decision became final. By the time consent forms were placed in front of him, the truth about his relationship to Gracie no longer complicated the choice. It clarified it. The medical staff explained risks again, slower this time, making space for reconsideration. Julian listened carefully. He asked practical questions. Recovery time, long-term effects, what life would look like after surgery. He wanted to understand the path forward, not the fear behind it. When the surgeon finished, Julian nodded. "I'm ready." Gracie sat beside him, hands folded tightly together. She had already tried to argue once, quietly, late at night when the children were asleep. "You've done enough," she had said. Julian had looked at her steadily. "I'm not done." Now, in the pre-op room, Gracie watched him change into a hospital gown, the reality settling in more fully than it had before. This wasn't paperwork. This wasn't theory. This was action. "You don't have to be brave," she said softly. Julian smiled faintly. "I'm not trying to be." A nurse entered to review final details. Identification confirmed. Procedures explained. Julian answered calmly, his voice even. When the nurse stepped out, Gracie stood. "I don't know how to say thank you for this," she said, emotion tightening her voice. Julian reached for her hand. "You don't have to. This isn't repayment. It's continuity." Gracie swallowed. "I wish you'd known sooner." Julian shook his head gently. "I knew when it mattered." They embraced briefly, not clinging, not dramatic, just present. Julian was wheeled down the hallway moments later. Overhead lights passed steadily, one after another. He focused on breathing evenly, letting his thoughts settle. He thought of Gracie at 7, sitting patiently outside the construction site. Of her calm courage when she exposed the lie about the missing chair. Of the way she had looked at him the first time she called him Daddy, not seeking approval, but offering trust. He thought of her daughter, small hands, observant eyes, strength hidden behind quiet smiles. This was not fear. This was purpose. In another wing of the hospital, Gracie's daughter lay prepared for surgery, unaware of the full weight of what was happening. She had asked earlier if Grandpa would be okay. Gracie had kissed her forehead. "He's strong," she said, "and he loves you." Hours passed. Gracie sat in the waiting room, her son asleep against her shoulder. She didn't pace. She didn't cry. She held herself together the same way she always had, by staying still and alert. Doctors moved in and out. Time stretched. When the surgeon finally approached, Gracie stood immediately. "The surgery went well," he said. "Both procedures." Gracie exhaled. The breath she'd been holding for hours finally released. "Julian is stable," the surgeon continued, "and the transplant was successful." Gracie pressed a hand to her mouth, emotion rising at last. "Thank you." Later, when she was allowed into Julian's recovery room, she approached quietly. He lay pale but steady, eyes closed, machines humming softly nearby. She sat beside him and took his hand. "You did it," she whispered. Julian opened his eyes slowly, recognizing her voice. "Is she okay?" he asked, voice rough. Gracie nodded. "She's going to be." Julian closed his eyes again, relief settling in. He had given without knowing the full truth at first. He had loved without confirmation. And now, having discovered everything, he would give again if asked. Because the choice had never depended on information, only on love. Recovery didn't arrive as a celebration. It arrived as careful monitoring, measured steps, and quiet relief that grew stronger with every hour that passed. Gracie's daughter woke slowly in the recovery unit, eyes fluttering open, as machines hummed softly around her. A nurse leaned in, smiling gently. "You did great," she said. The child blinked, confused but calm. "Where's Grandpa?" "He's resting," the nurse replied. "Just like you." When Gracie was allowed in, she approached the bed quietly, brushing a hand through her daughter's hair. The child smiled faintly. "Did it work?" she asked. Gracie nodded, tears finally spilling over. "Yes, baby, it worked." The doctors were cautious but hopeful. Numbers improved. Color returned. Strength followed slowly, day by day. Julian's recovery moved at its own pace. He was tired but alert, asking questions as soon as he was able. "How is she today?" he asked every morning. Each answer brought relief. She walked a little farther. She ate more. She smiled. Those details mattered more than statistics. Weeks passed. The hospital routines loosened. 4 lines were removed. Chairs replaced beds. The family learned a new rhythm, one built on healing rather than fear. One afternoon, Gracie brought her daughter into Julian's room in a wheelchair. The child looked smaller than he remembered, but her eyes were bright. "Hi, Grandpa," she said. Julian smiled weakly. "Hey there, superhero." She laughed softly. "Mom says I have a strong kidney now." Julian nodded. "You always were strong." They sat together quietly, hands touching, the weight of what had been given settling into something gentle. Life didn't return to normal immediately. It returned better. Healing wasn't only physical. As Julian regained strength and Gracie's daughter returned to school part-time, Gracie and Julian found themselves in conversations they had postponed for years. Not about blame, about understanding. They walked together often during Julian's recovery. Short distances at first, then farther. Conversations unfolded naturally, without agenda. "I used to think love needed proof," Gracie said once. Julian nodded. "I used to think love needed control." They laughed softly at that. Gracie spoke about her mother with clarity now, not resentment. Curiosity had softened into compassion. "She believed I'd be okay," Gracie said. And she was right. Julian felt that truth settled deeply. She trusted you. And she trusted me, even without knowing it. Gracie stopped walking and looked at him. "You were always my father." Before anyone told us, Julian met her gaze. "You were always my daughter." They didn't need more words. Their bond no longer rested on discovery. It rested on years of shared choice, showing up, staying present, loving without condition. At home, laughter returned fully. Meals felt lighter. Plans extended into the future without fear. Gracie's daughter regained energy quickly. Her brother followed her everywhere, proud and protective. Julian watched it all with gratitude. Not possessive, not fearful, just steady. Healing didn't erase the past. It made sense of it. Months later, Julian stood in the kitchen watching Gracie prepare dinner while her children talked over one another at the table. The scene felt ordinary in the best way. This was family, not because of shared blood, though that truth had emerged, but because of shared life. Julian reflected on everything that had brought them here. The construction site, the waiting, the adoption, the years of presence without explanation. Love had arrived before clarity, and when clarity finally came, love didn't change, it deepened. Gracie turned to him. "You okay?" Julian smiled. "I'm exactly where I'm supposed to be." Later that night, as the house quieted, Julian sat beside Gracie on the couch. "Thank you for trusting me," he said. Gracie shook her head. "Thank you for choosing me. Before you knew." They sat there. The weight of the journey settled into peace. Some people wait for answers before they commit. Others commit and discover the answers later. Julian Cross had built structures his entire life, but the most enduring thing he ever built was a family, not from certainty, but from love. Some people wait for DNA to love. Others love first and discover the truth later. If this story moved you, please like, share, comment, and subscribe to Mr. Austin Love and Story Tales. Stories like this save hearts. They sat there. The weight of the journey settled into peace. Some people wait for answers before they commit. Others commit and discover the answers later. Julian Cross had built structures his entire life, but the most enduring thing he ever built was a family, not from certainty, but from love. Some people wait for DNA to love. Others love first and discover the truth later. If this story moved you, please like, share, comment, and subscribe to Mr. Austin Love and Story Tales. Stories like this save hearts.
If you enjoy American Love Stories, please consider subscribing and comment what you need next. And love you all from Mr. Austin.